Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Harborne Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 149, which is the 11th session on the Treaty of Hudaibiyah and the second one we're doing on the lessons from the Treaty of Hudaibiyah. And as I say, it's taken us quite some time to go through it in detail, mainly because there's a lot of information there, a lot of things happened, but also it's such a significant event that happens in the Seerah. And again, the other significant things that have taken a long time during our study circles, the Battle of Badr, and the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of Ahzab. But this, as I say, is a monumental event. So it's important to give it its due. So in the last session we did a quick recap on the previous 9 sessions of Hudaibiyah. And the reasons for the Prophet ﷺ to announce that he's going out for pilgrimage, and one of them was to isolate the people of Khaybar from the Quraish and to create a propaganda momentum in favor of the Muslims as they sort of pursue this new and aggressive foreign policy agenda in the post-Ahzab Khandaq era, where the Prophet ﷺ said, we will no longer sit back and be attacked, we will now go forward and take the fight to the other people. So the Muslims set out peacefully for pilgrimage after the announcement in the sacred month, and they dodged the attempts of the Quraish to stop their movements, and they rerouted and camped at Hudaibiyah. Then there were multiple negotiations which concluded in a 10-year peace treaty between the Quraysh and the Muslims. In the interim, there were some rumours that Uthman had been killed, and the Prophet ﷺ had taken the pledge of fighting from the 1400 pilgrims. The Muslims returned to Medina, not having done their pilgrimage, but they were said that they could, as a treaty condition, go back the following year. And we talked about the political and some of the dawah benefits and the impact of the treaty in the last session. And one of the foremost ones is we have the legitimacy of the Islamic State, which the Muslims had established in Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ established this Islamic State. It had always been portrayed as a terrorist or an extremist or an outlying state, a group of people. Now it had been given legitimacy, with the Quraysh sitting down at the table and negotiating with them. So that active process of negotiation has now elevated the Muslims as being a legitimate authority. And that now gives permission for other tribes to start to interact with the Muslims at the same political level. The Qurayshi propaganda, which they'd been doing for 15 years almost against the Muslims, was now starting to become neutralized. And through their shenanigans at Hudaibiyah, by preventing the Muslims from doing the pilgrimage, the Muslims were seen as being, people of the rule of law, peaceful people. They weren't there to cause trouble. And the Quraysh were now seen as being antagonistic and war hungry, and not open to reason. So these were really important propaganda benefits. And again, we'll talk about this next time, inshallah, where the Muslims were now able to turn their attention to the plot of the people of Khaybar to ally themselves with the Quraysh and to attack the Muslims. The treaty then also, as I said, forced the Quraysh to treat the Muslims as equal partners, and the Quraysh had now, through this treaty and the run-up to the treaty, indirectly relinquished their claim of religious superiority and religious leadership over the Arab people. By preventing people from doing the pilgrimage, they are the custodians of the Kaaba, preventing people from doing pilgrimage. They have basically lost a lot of authority in terms of being morally superior and religiously superior. So again, the pendulum is swinging in favor of the Muslims. And now, after being persecuted in Makkah, emigrating, setting up the society in Medina, and being under constant fear of attack and being wiped out, with this 10-year peace treaty with their main enemies, the Muslims were now able to live in a sense of comfort and security, and to do trade and to build their society. So huge spin-off benefits through this treaty for the Muslims. And consequently, the Prophet ﷺ is now able to pursue a new and independent foreign policy and to act as embodying a politically independent entity in Medina. And so the way that their posture is internally and externally significantly changes and is elevated because of the Treaty of Hudaibiyah. And we talked about how and we'll come on to this again later today, inshallah, the Sahabi their status was elevated because of Hudaibiyah, because in terms of ranks of the Muslims after the Prophet ﷺ, you've got the Sadiqeen, you've got the Ashra Mubashra, the 10 who were granted paradise whilst they were alive, then you've got the people of Badr, and then you've got the people who gave the pledge of Ridwan. So that's how they are ranked. And then also, really importantly, the Treaty of Hudaibiyah directly led to the conquest of Makkah, in as far as it was a breach of one of the terms of the contract that the Prophet ﷺ then annulled the contract and essentially declared war on Makkah. So if there wasn't a Treaty of Hudaibiyah, the conquest of Makkah may not have happened as it happened. So again, all of these things are critically important in terms of the spread of Islam. So inshallah, today we'll talk about some of the religious benefits, we'll talk about some of the fiqh benefits, and then some of the sort of modern political implications of Hudaibiyah and how different people use it in different ways, inshallah. So one of the greatest benefits of Hudaibiyah and the whole issues is the issue of the Qadr of Allah. So we've talked about this before in the study circle, we live within two spheres of influence. There's the sphere that we control, and there's the sphere that controls us. So in the sphere that we control, we initiate actions, and we are judged according to our actions and our intentions. Things that happen outside of our control, these are things from Allah, and we have to take it as a test or a blessing, and Allah seeing how we react to those situations. And for the vast majority of people, even including the Prophet ﷺ, on the face of it, Hudaibiyah seemed like a complete humiliation. They'd announced peacefully that they're going for pilgrimage, and they weren't allowed to do it. And every condition that the Quraish imposed, no pilgrimage this year. Anyone who defects from Medina to Makkah stays in Makkah, but anyone who defects from Makkah to Medina has to be returned to Makkah. So this seemingly one-sided treaty was perceived as a complete humiliation. But it turned out to be the greatest victory for the Muslims, right? And Allah references this in the Qur'an. It's possible that you hate something, but Allah will bring a lot of good from that thing that you hate. So things that happen outside of our control in the Qadr of Allah, we need to, have our relationship with that situation in a very different way, and we learn from the way that the Sahabi reacted to that. You could see the unshakable iman of the Muslims, that they stuck together, right? And they agreed to something they clearly didn't like. So firstly, they agreed to fight to the death when they heard that Uthman had been killed. But then, and then secondly, when it came to the actual treaty, all of them, down to a man, did not like the terms of the treaty, yet they agreed to it, and they held firm to it. So this highlights their courage and their readiness to sacrifice for the sake of Islam, for the sake of Allah, right? And so these are really important aspects that we need to learn and benefit from. That things that don't seem beneficial to us, that actually we need to put our trust in Allah. This is the Qadr of Allah, and that's how we live our life. One of the other religious benefits at the time was that the Muslims in Makkah were given glad tidings, and they were given moral support through the visit of Uthman, and they effectively became a pocket of believers within the enemy stronghold of Makkah. Again, lots of things that we can learn from that. The strength that they were given, through this good news. But another really important sort of religious benefit, and again a political understanding from this, is that, and again it's quite a technical issue, is the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't accept anyone's advice when he was signing the Treaty of Hudaibiyah. So here, this is a really important, sort of fiqh and religious issue in the Seerah. So he ignored Shura. Now, Shura is clearly defined in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So he sought advice in the Battle of Uhud, right, as to whether the Muslims should fight inside Medina or outside Medina. His preference was inside Medina, but the Shura, the consultation, the consensus was they should fight outside Medina. Likewise, at the Battle of Badr, he sought Shura as to where they should camp. Should they camp in front of the well or behind the well? And he was advised to camp in front of the well. Okay, and we talked about the ifk of Aisha, that the Prophet ﷺ, he did Shura, and he sought advice of some of the Sahabi in the case of the slander against Aisha. So he sat down with Zayd, he sat down with Ali, and he talked to the Sahabi, and he did Shura with the people. So these are all permissible forms of advice, right? But in this matter, the Treaty of Hudaibiyah, where Allah has clearly decided a hukm, the Prophet ﷺ, could not undertake Shura, right? He was not allowed to take the majority opinion of the Sahabi in this matter. So he had to, listen to the command of Allah, and this is clear when he's being, egged during the Treaty of Hudaibiyah, when they're writing the terms. He's clearly saying, as we said before, to the companions, he has no choice in the matter, but he has to agree to these terms. So in matters of religion, in matters of Hukm of Allah, of Sharia, we have no opinion. There is no Shura in these matters. In permissible matters, we can do Shura, and we have to do Shura. But when it comes to areas where there is the Hukm of Allah, we don't take the majority opinion into consideration. So there is no Shura in the Hukm of Allah. Again, and this is in the tafsir of the Qur'an, where Allah says, it is not for the believer, man or woman, when Allah and His Messenger have decided a matter, that they have any option in their decision. And whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he has indeed strayed into plain error. So the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't involve himself in Shura, consultation, when conducting the treaty negotiation, as he'd done on other occasions. And that demonstrated that Hudaibiyah was revelation that he had to follow. And again, this comes on to the later issue of the politics involved in terms of how we can use Hudaibiyah or not in terms of modern political theory in how we enter into negotiations with our enemies. So again, that's a really important issue around when to do Shura and when you are not allowed to do Shura. Also, we talked about how in terms of some of the religious benefits, the remnants of the Prophet ﷺ's wudu, his spit, his hair, they all have blessings, and people sought those blessings. So, we clearly see the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he is doing wudu, and the emissaries are watching how the Muslims would clamber around the Prophet ﷺ to take the drops of water that are coming off him as he's doing wudu, who would try to catch the spit from the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ when he's doing when he's spitting it out, when he's rinsing his mouth, and they would take that and they would rub it on themselves. Okay, and people might cringe nowadays, but for the Sahabi, they saw these things as having blessings in them, and the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't deny that. He didn't tell them off, right? So he said clearly they can seek blessings from those things, and Allah had allowed that, right? But the Prophet ﷺ, he then gave advice to the other people. There's on another occasion when he was doing wudu and people were doing the same sort of thing, and he asked the people, why are you doing this? And they said, because we wish to get the blessings. The Prophet ﷺ then said, whoever wishes Allah and his messenger to love him, let him be truthful in his speech, trustworthy in his promises, and let him not irritate his neighbors. So yes, you can seek blessings by getting these things, right? And then we've got all, you've got where you go to Topkapi Museum, or you go to other places, and there's the hair of the Prophet ﷺ, or there's his sandals, or his turban. Reportedly, people seek blessings associated with that. The Prophet ﷺ is not forbidding that, but he's saying if you want better blessings, then speak truthfully, be trustworthy, right? So again, so some of these issues that we talked about, and those blessings are related to the Prophet ﷺ himself and only him. We cannot and are not allowed to seek those similar types of blessings from any other human being. There is no evidence for that. So those blessings are unique to the Prophet ﷺ, not to any other human being since the Prophet ﷺ, now or in any other preceding generation. Another benefit, religious benefit, we talked about the issue of al-fa'al, which is optimism and good omens. So it's having a positive mental outlook, looking at things in a positive way, and ascribing positive religious connotations to an event. Okay, and so the permissibility of that, as opposed to, and also the prohibition of bad omens. Okay, so we are not allowed to engage in superstition and ascribing bad things onto events that are happening, right? And all of these superstitious beliefs, the Prophet came to destroy and to annul. So those superstitious things, your black cats, your walking under ladders and all those sort of things, broken mirrors, those bad superstitions, not allowed. But looking at positive things in a positive way and ascribing it to Allah, we are allowed, as long as it fulfills two conditions, right? That it is a positive sign or a message, so it doesn't have bad luck, negative connotations, so it's a positive thing. And secondly, that the positive thing, the message, is linked to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that you say it is from Allah. Okay, so and this was related to when Suhail bin Amr was coming to negotiate. The Prophet ﷺ said, Allah has made our situation easy, because the word Suhail comes from to make things easy. So the Prophet ﷺ, he interpreted that event, which was outside his control, in a positive way. And we're allowed to do that because it's a positive thing. And we are linking it to Allah. Allah is making our life easy for us. So we can, as I say, do these things, look for positive things, good omens, because it's about having a positive mindset and having a positive trust in Allah. And Allah loves that for us, where we ascribe all the good to Allah. And so these are things which are recommended. We also talked about one of the other religious and fiqh issues around how it's standing guard for people of importance, typically, and the Prophet ﷺ had discouraged or forbidden a Muslim ruler to sit whilst everyone stands in his presence. Okay, so the general rule is you don't stand up as a token of respect. So that's the general rule. So you're in a gathering, people come in, you tend to remain seated. You shouldn't have the expectation of standing up for respect. Okay, but here you had the emissaries from the Quraish come for the negotiations, and the Prophet ﷺ, he instructed people like Abu Bakr to stand up with their swords ready. Right. So again, although this wasn't the sort of the habit of the Prophet ﷺ to have armed bodyguards, but he was demonstrating an environment where the emissaries would recognize and they would see that as being that protocol of respect. Okay, so by surrounding themselves by armed guards and demonstrating that people are respecting the Prophet ﷺ, when your foreign dignitaries were coming in, it was sending a message to the other people. But so in these exceptions, that operating in that way is allowed. But as a general rule, we shouldn't be expected to stand up when people come in, and we can do it, but the expectation should not be there. So when somebody comes in and he'll, where you may be in these gatherings where they criticize, well, why are you still standing? Or sorry, why are you still sitting down? You need to stand up and respect me. That is not allowed in Islam. And then we also talked about, again, it's to do with superstitions, how it was raining at one time, and it rained really hard during the sort of 2.5-3 weeks that they were camped in Hudaibiyah. And one of those nights when it was raining, some of the people were saying that it rained because of such and such a star. And that was the belief, that was some of the Jahiliyyah beliefs that they had, that they would ascribe some events that had happened to different stars. And so it had rained, it was because such and such a star was shining, that's why it rained. And then the Prophet ﷺ, after one of the prayers, he got up and he said to the people, do you know what Allah said last night? Allah said, some of my believers have woken up believing in me, and others have woken up believing in the stars and rejecting me. It's not saying that they become kufr, it's just basically saying that they're performing this minor shirk, where, and we've talked about this before, they're ascribing external events to supernatural phenomena that don't exist. So Allah has power over all things, and we should ascribe all these things to Allah. And when we ascribe these external things to other things, other people or other events, that is a form of minor shirk. And again, in this sort of in this age of COVID and lockdown, where people are talking about health and public health, we talk about who provides the cure. The cure, the shifa, is provided by Allah. He may do that through the effort of a doctor or of some medication. So when you've got a headache and you take some paracetamol, if you believe the paracetamol tablets cure your headache or your pain, that is a form of minor shirk. What you need to believe, and as Muslims we believe, is that Allah provides the cure through the paracetamol or the ibuprofen, or through the doctor as they perform their job. Right? It's not them who are healing you, it's Allah using that as a way of providing the healing. Sometimes you take some paracetamol or you take the doctor's prescription and it doesn't work. Other times it does work. And it's just recognizing that the cure is from Allah. Likewise, the rain isn't because of such and such a star or such and such an event, or ascribing an eclipse to this or that. These are just natural phenomena, and the good and the bad is from Allah. Again, that's one of the other things that we talked about. Some of the other fiqh and religious benefits that we talked about is the fact, and again we'll come on to this in the next section as well, the permissibility of entering into peace treaties with your enemy. Now here you have the Quraish, who are sworn enemies of the Prophet ﷺ and sworn enemies of Islam. They want to completely wipe out the Muslims, and they want to wipe out the Prophet ﷺ. Yet the Prophet ﷺ was still allowed to enter into negotiations and to conduct and conclude a peace treaty with the most evil people on earth at the time. So if the Prophet ﷺ is allowed to engage in negotiations in a peace treaty in that environment, then you can see other rightly guided leaders of the Ummah, and again, you can't infer that necessarily to the current political leaders we have today, but other rightly appointed leaders of the Muslims, they are also allowed to engage into their own peace treaties and their own negotiations with the different people that they will be around. Whether all political treaties and negotiations have a time limit, there's a difference of opinion. Some scholars say the maximum allowable international treaty is for 10 years, and you need to keep renewing it after that. Whereas other scholars say that actually you can have an open-ended peace treaty that doesn't need to be continually renewed. Again, this is a fiqh issue, and there are differences of opinion on that. Again, I don't need to do that, but just need to be aware that there are these ways the scholars have looked at how Hudaibiyah has impacted on the way we understand things. Also, we talked about how the Prophet, how generally speaking, cursing and swearing and saying profanities are not allowed. They are prohibited. However, we have the example where Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he uttered a curse, and a very vulgar curse. I'm not going to repeat that, but he uttered a very vulgar curse because somebody had insulted Islam and the Prophet ﷺ, right? And because Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he uttered that curse, he wasn't criticized by the Prophet ﷺ for uttering that curse in front of the Prophet ﷺ and in front of the emissary. And in fact, the emissary then kept silent and said, "My silence is your repaying of the debt of the 10 or so camels that you owe me." That's how much of a curse Abu Bakr, and a mild-mannered person like Abu Bakr, saying something on that occasion. Again, it shows that in certain scenarios it is permissible to do that, but that is only when Islam is being insulted, not on a personal level. He wasn't saying it specifically against Abu Bakr, but Abu Bakr sought to defend Islam in this way. Also, some new fiqh that we learnt because of Hudaibiyah is, and this is something new that hadn't occurred before, if people are unable to complete their Hajj or their Umrah, they are allowed to stop where they are prevented from going, shave their hair, sacrifice their animals, and come out of Ihram, and that still counts as them fulfilling their obligations. And again, this was a new Hukm at the time, and the Sahabi, when the Prophet ﷺ ordered them to do that, after the conclusion of the treaty, they didn't do that until he then got up and shaved his hair and started sacrificing the animals. Again, so this is where this is now permitted, and this was introduced. And also related to that, that we talked about, there's someone, Qab bin al-Ujra, who was suffering from a severe infestation of lice, and he was becoming ill because of that. So for this legitimate reason, he was able to shave his hair, and that didn't break his ihram. He was allowed to do the fidya and feed the people, and that's completely acceptable. So for medical reasons, if there are impediments to your performing certain duties that are required for Hajj or Umrah, you are allowed to do that so long as you give the fidya. Other scholars have said it's allowed to take, and we've talked about this before, the help of the pagan or the mushrik if you trust him, because the Prophet it said that he did allow one of the pagans to help guide, reroute them. Others say that was actually a Muslim, but there are the first envoy that the Prophet sent, Bishr. Some say that he was a pagan when the Prophet sent him to negotiate with the Quraish. Others say that actually he was a new convert. But anyway, the scholars use this incident, these incidents as supporting evidence when they talk about seeking the help of the mushrikeen. Also, we talked about how the Prophet kept to the letter of the treaty, so the letter of the law, even if it contradicted the spirit of the treaty. So when Abu Basir came back, the Prophet stuck to the letter of the treaty. He didn't himself send him back. He just said, if the people from Makkah come and take you, you have to go back. Yet when the women who migrated, who left Makkah, came to Medina, the Prophet kept them. And again, that is keeping to the letter of the treaty, because the treaty specifically said no man shall leave Makkah except that he has to be returned. Here you've got a woman who's leaving, right? And no doubt when Sahel was writing that condition, it's generally said when no man leaves, you infer it's no man and no woman, no person, right? So that's the inference. But the Prophet, he accepted that inference, but when it came to implementing the treaty, the letter of the law, he just stuck to the letter of the law. So again, it's about the permissibility of sticking to the letter of the treaty. Again, we're not allowed to be treacherous in our treaty dealings. We're not allowed to say one thing in the treaty and then completely go against it, or to rip the treaty up without, due regard or due process. We also talked about, and again, this is especially important nowadays in lockdown days, that on one of the occasions it was raining so heavily that the Maghrib and Isha were not prayed in Jama'ah, and the Muazzin, he gave the adhan and he changed the adhan rather than saying, come quickly to pray. So rather than saying Hayya Salah, he said pray in your tents, right? So rather than calling people to the masjid to pray, the Muazzin said pray in your homes, pray in your tents. Okay, so again we have that from here, and again, Jama'ah wasn't done in those situations. People prayed at home, and again, people can infer now that we are permitted in a lockdown environment to pray in our homes. It's not obligatory to go to the mosques. Again, there are differences of opinions around what that means for Jummah, and again, don't need to go into that here. And we talked again how the Prophet it's reported that he overslept for Fajr on the way back, and as soon as you wake up, you need to seek forgiveness and pray as soon as you can, and certainly before the next prayer. We also talked about how, as a group of pilgrims, they were essentially unarmed, but they had Abad bin Bishr leading the convoy as an armed guard, and that's permissible. And the Prophet ﷺ, he had his own independent intelligence network, a spy network led by Bishr bin Ibn Safwan, gathering intel about their journey as they're making their way towards Makkah and then when they camped at Hudaibiyah. So these are some of the sort of religious and fiqh benefits. Finally, just to conclude, I want to talk just a couple of minutes about some of the modern implications of Hudaibiyah and what it means in terms of modern political theory and how we look at the world and life around us. And again, just going back onto the earlier point where the Prophet ﷺ, when it came to the Treaty of Hudaibiyah, this was the Hukm of Allah, right? He was compelled to agree to the terms of condition, terms of any conditional terms that the Quraish imposed. And he said that clearly before signing the treaty. He said, whatever they insist upon, I will agree to that, as long as it maintains the honor of Islam. So he ignored Shura on this occasion. And on other occasions, he clearly did Shura in Badr, in Uhud, in the HISC, but here there is no Shura. And again, we infer that there is no Shura in the Hukm of Allah. You don't put it to a vote. You don't say the majority of people think this is okay, therefore I will do it. And Allah says, it is not for a believer, man or woman, when Allah and His Messenger have decided on a matter, that they have any option in their decision. And whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger, he has indeed strayed into plain error. The Prophet did not involve himself in Shura, and so therefore when people are using Hudaibiyah as a way of agreeing for all sorts of political shenanigans nowadays, people need to be very careful. Some people say that, some people try to use Hudaibiyah as a justification that Muslims are allowed to enter into negotiation with people to do for all sorts of things. Whereas a lot of scholars say the stronger opinion is that you're not allowed to. You need to stick to the Hukm of Allah. So, for example, there are lots of issues around, say, Palestine or the Muslims in other territories, in the Uyghur, the Muslims, or in Rohingya or other places, where if you are entering into a treaty, you need to maintain the Hukm of Allah, what is essential in terms of maintaining the integrity of the Islamic lands and the Muslims. They are things which are generally not negotiable. You can't use the Treaty of Hudaibiyah, as people have done, to say basically you can compromise anything. So people say, because the Prophet seemingly compromised on these issues, when it comes to Islam, we are allowed to compromise. And that is a false equivalency. You can't use Hudaibiyah to say that compromise is allowed in the ruling of Islam. The Hudaibiyah was not a compromise situation for Prophet ﷺ because he was following the Hukm of Allah. He'd been ordered to do this. So again, we need to be careful how we use the Hudaibiyah to justify a political compromise. The Prophet ﷺ didn't politically compromise. He was following the Hukm of Allah. So again, so whenever you in sort of modern, and people, they talk about the Oslo Agreement where the PLO made an agreement with the State of Israel, and they justify it using Hudaibiyah. Again, it's not the right equivalency. You can't compromise and give up things based on what the Prophet ﷺ did it, because he did it. He was following the Hukm of Allah. It's not a political game where we weigh things up. You're allowed to weigh things up when in areas that are permissible, where you can do Shura. And then finally, looking at some of the sort of the many hypocrisies that we see in Western countries when they look at what are their sacred cows, and they sort of inflict that upon the Muslims. And again, some of these examples are the ones I gave back in 2012 when I did the study circle first on the Treaty of Hudaibiyah. So, for example, what I'm saying is that here that you had the Quraish being custodians of the house of Allah, and allowing people for pilgrimage, and they had never before prevented people from pilgrimage, and you're not allowed to do that. And they said, look, this is who we're about. Yet they compromised on that. Yet they became hypocrites by preventing the Muslims from doing pilgrimage. They were not allowed to do that. This went against their core values of who they were. Likewise, we see in modern societies, you've got people who claim that they are all for freedom of speech. One of their fundamental values that they have in terms of how they live their life, they say they are pro freedom of speech, right? And so people are allowed to criticize Islam, criticize Muslims because it's freedom of speech. And they're allowed to criticize the Prophet ﷺ because it's freedom of speech, and draw cartoons and all that sort of stuff. In fact, when it comes to criticizing Islam, people are encouraged to do that. Yet when Muslims speak out against Western values, against Western hypocrisy, there's no freedom of speech anymore. And so this is completely hypocritical, right? Muslims become labeled as extremists and are prosecuted for having books or other things, and we can't claim freedom of speech because we're seen as supporting terrorism. So this is complete duality, and again, we need to expose the duality that the Prophet ﷺ was exposing in Quraish society. Quraish pretend to, look after the rule of brethren, look after tribes, look after their own, look after the house of Allah, look after the rights of pilgrimage, yet they threw them all away. And the propaganda coup that the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims had was highlighting through Hudaibiyah the rank hypocrisy of the Quraish. So we should use the rank hypocrisy that we see around us to highlight the inequities in society. Freedom of speech, freedom of wealth. It's okay for Western countries to own the resources of other nations, and they promulgate that. They say this is really important, that we are allowed to own the wealth of other people. Yet when it comes to Muslims or other people, buying into Western institutions, they prevent them. So a few years ago, the Western countries prevented Dubai from buying the American port authorities. Or nowadays they prevent China from investing and buying certain national infrastructure things. So that's quite hypocritical, where the West is allowed to buy things in Muslim countries, but then stop other countries buying their things. And they impose unfair taxes and tariffs on imported goods to protect their own markets, yet they want other countries and other, especially Muslim countries, to open up their markets completely via the IMF and the World Bank, etc. So again, it's showing the hypocrisy of freedom of wealth. And again, they talk about freedom of belief, freedom of religion. You can believe in your religion so long as you stay out of politics. So, Muslims, if Muslims criticize the killing of Muslims based on the fact that they're Muslims, we get criticized. So when other people, invade Muslim countries or criticize or wage war against Muslims, and Muslims stand up and criticize that or make dua for those Muslims who are oppressed, we get criticized for supporting Muslims. And that's just complete hypocrisy, because if you look at the news here in Western countries, certainly in the UK, the UK news is about the UK, but also it has an unhealthy preponderance of stories from the USA, from Australia, and from other countries where people share the same values. It doesn't focus a lot of news on Latin America, on African countries, or in the Middle East, right? So they have this bond through their ideas with people who are like them. Yet when Muslims want to to have that bond with their own people who think like them, we get criticized. I think freedom of religion, it's so stark nowadays, that we're not allowed to dress how we want to dress. They ban the hijab, they ban the niqab, and they allow the nuns, right, and monks, and nowadays especially they said that you can't wear the niqab because we can't see someone's face when you're talking to them. And the hypocrisy now is everyone's walking around with a face mask because of COVID. Where have these security issues gone now? So again, it's persecution of Muslims for being Muslims. Again, we need to highlight this rank hypocrisy that they claim to have freedom of religion, but that it's not there for the Muslims. And again, if we want to say we believe in this and we want to do this because Islam says so, we're not allowed to do that because it's too political for them. And again, these issues around personal freedom, again, around masks, you can wear whatever you like so long as you don't look like a Muslim. Again, we need to highlight these things. Again, a few final things: rule of law. A lot of countries, Western countries especially, pride themselves as being people who adhere to the rule of law. Yet increasingly, you'll see it's one rule for them and a different rule for the Muslims. Right? You look at what's happening in Guantanamo Bay, and then you've got Abu Ghraib, you've got assassinations, you've got invading innocent countries. Muslims nowadays, even in Western countries, are proven guilty until they are proven innocent. Especially with the way that they write the laws around terrorism. The habeas corpus has been suspended for Muslims. The right to silence is no longer there in terrorism prosecutions. Again, you can't say we uphold the rule of law, but we have a separate standard for Muslims. But that is essentially what we see. Democracy, it's supposed to be ruling of the people, for the people, by the people, but in essence, it's ruling of the people, by the few, for the very rich, right? And if people really believed in democracy, of the people, for the people, by the people, why are all of these countries supporting these brutal dictators around the world? If you are freedom loving and democracy loving, you should not be supporting and entering into deals with these countries, who have these brutal dictators, especially, leaders of the Muslim countries who are brutal dictators who sometimes overturn democracies. And we saw that in Algeria in the 80s. We saw that in Egypt recently. And the Western countries, they conveniently forget about democracy then, and they are happy to support brutal dictators. Again, we hear a lot about open and tolerant and transparent societies, or open and transparent societies, yet they're not. Their antagonism to things like WikiLeaks and freedom of information requests show that actually they say one thing, but actually the way they do things, they are far from being transparent in their dealings. Again, we say that this is a tolerant society, but the Muslims lived in a tolerant society for over 1,000 years that was pluralistic. People from all walks of life, all beliefs were allowed to flourish. Increasingly, we're told in these societies that claim to be tolerant, you can do what you like, but you have to wear these things. You have to believe in these things. You have to read these things. You can mix it with only the people we tell you can mix with. And we are accused of being marginalized and living separate lives because we want to live amongst Muslims. But when a lot of Westerners and certainly people from the UK go and live in Dubai or in Spain, they form their own little ghettos and communities and don't interact with society. They're not criticized for the way they live there, but we're criticized for the way we live in these countries. And so, where's the tolerance there? And the increasingly there's this idea of muscular liberalism, right? So the sense of a tolerant society has gone out the window. They will only tolerate you so long as you agree with them. That's not tolerance. Finally, the last thing is, this Orwellian notion that Western countries are nations of peace. They've launched war after war for the last 200-300 years, right? These are militaristic societies that enforce their views and opinions on others by brute force. For example, the United States has over 1,000 military bases in foreign countries. So what makes that different to an empire? So again, we need to just as the Prophet ﷺ exposed the fallacy of the Quraish society through Hudaibiyah, we need to also start to engage in this political interaction with society, highlighting the evils of society and how they live, and what Islam says about the beauty of Islam. And again, that's a very deep political interaction, but again, it's something that we should understand how best to take things forward and best to take the learning from Hudaibiyah. So inshallah, I'll finish there. I've gone slightly over time, but inshallah, hope there's a lot of benefit in there. Next time we will move on from Hudaibiyah. We'll come on to Khaybar. But a final thing to mention, and again we'll talk about it at the beginning of the next time, is that the Prophet ﷺ, he's going back following the Hudaibiyah. One of the first things he does is he writes to the people in Abyssinia who've been there all this time and says, come back now. And we'll talk about that next time, inshallah. So do remember us in your du'as. Do remember the ummah in your du'as. Do remember all the people who've been affected by these illnesses in your du'as. And thank you again for listening. And inshallah, until next time, والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Jazakallah khair. And as I say, next time 150 inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.